We have a nice crowd in person and we have a big crowd online, and that's really all we can ask for. So thank you. The purpose of our gathering here today is to talk about BDS and some of the legal ramifications and why it is being used to stifle free speech, and how it's being used to stifle free speech, and what we can do about it. And hopefully there's going to be a lot of provocative conversation, a lot of provocative questions. So my other comment this afternoon is, if you've been listening to the news lately, you might think that boycotts, divestment, and sanctions is a great thing. It's unpatriotic not to be talking about boycott, divestment, and sanction of Russia right now. Back in the 1980s, it was very popular to talk about the boycott, divestment, and sanction from South Africa in order to end apartheid. Unfortunately, we're real selective in terms of who we choose to boycott, divest, and sanction. And it is not so popular to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel for actually the same things that South Africa did to its people, apartheid, and actually for the same things that Russia's doing militarily. We've seen it all in Gaza before. So we're here to talk about some of that. And my other duty here is to turn it over to Don Bryant, who's one of the organizers of this event, to make some introductions. And again, I thank you for your participation. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, so Josie says they can hear us, and you can hear me as well, right? Thank you so much for coming today for our panel discussion, how the Israeli government and anti-BDS forces threaten free speech. And here we are at Cleveland State University in Cleveland, Ohio. I will just introduce the speakers that will be coming on shortly. First of all, Mazin Qumsiyeh, professor of Bethlehem and Sate universities in occupied West Bank. He's the author of a number of books, including Sharing the Land of Canaan. Secondly, Nahida Gordon, professor emeritus at Case Western Reserve University and author of a number of publications, including Palestine is Our Home. Terry Lodge, Toledo-based attorney and activist in a number of social justice struggles. He was a leader of the opposition to Ohio's HB 476, the anti-BDS law. And finally, Eric Resnick, Canton-based journalist and also an activist in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement in Northeast Ohio. Welcome to the speakers. Thank you very much. First of all, Mazin was running a little late from Occupied Palestine. I don't think that he is on yet. So if Nahida would like to start, we could begin with you, Nahida.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I want to begin by thanking the Free Speech Coalition in Ohio and the Israeli Apartheid Week for this opportunity to present my views on the BDS movement. I'm a Palestinian exile living in Northeast Ohio and will present my views on the subject. I will talk briefly about the origins of both the BDS movement and the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACBI for short. The Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel was initiated in 2004 and is a founding member of the Palestinian BDS National Committee, or BNC. Both are committed to freedom of expression as stipulated in the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and reject on principle, such as citizenship, race, gender, or religion. So they reject submitting people to BDS based on the identity of a person. This is an important point to keep in mind and contrasts with the BDS campaigns our government wages against citizens of other countries it deems undesirable. In 2005, Palestinian civil society organizations called for the BDS as a form of nonviolent pressure on Israel. 170 Palestinian organizations joined, their unions, refugee networks, women's organizations, professional associations, popular resistance committees, and other Palestinian civil society bodies support this movement. The Palestinian BDS was inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, and its call urges nonviolent pressure on Israel until it complies with international law by meeting 3 demands. I'll present these 3 demands and comment on them from my point of view. The first is ending Israel's occupation and colonization of all Palestinian and other Arab lands and dismantling the wall. International law recognizes the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Syrian Golan Heights as occupied by Israel. As part of its military occupation, Israel steals land and forces Palestinians into ghettos, surrounded by checkpoints, settlements, watchtowers, and an illegal apartheid wall, turning it into the largest open-air prison in the world, and regularly carries out large-scale assaults on Gaza that are widely condemned as constituting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Under Israeli occupation, Palestinians live with the fear of having their houses demolished, of deportation, of the inability to have sufficient food to feed their family, of not being able to reach a hospital in case of an emergency, of arrest, and of sudden death due to violence. These are some of the daily humiliations and oppressions or repressions experienced by Christian and Muslim Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation. I would add, moreover, that from my point of view, all of Palestine is occupied. As I demonstrate in my book, Palestine is Our Home, the recommended partition of Palestine was illegal, and Israel was created through war and mass exile of its Christian and Muslim population. Jaffa, the city where I was living in 1948, was to be part of the Arab section, and Jerusalem, where I was born, was to be an international zone. The second ask for BDS movement is recognizing that the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian Christians of Israel to full equality. 1/5 of Israel's citizens are Palestinians who remained inside the armistice lines after 1948. They're subjected to a system of racial discrimination enshrined in more than 50 laws that impact every aspect of their lives. The Israeli government continues to forcibly displace Palestinian communities in Israel from their lands. Israeli leaders routinely and openly incite racial violence against them. In the West Bank, Palestinians are controlled by the Israeli government using separate laws, many of them military laws. The ill treatment of Palestinians is consistent with the crime of apartheid as defined by the 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as inhumane acts of a character similar to other crimes against humanity committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over other racial group or groups, and committed with intent of maintaining that regime. That's a mouthful. The word racial here denotes a categorization of human beings based on shared physical or social qualities in the groups generally viewed as distinct within a given society. So for example, people of the Jewish faith who were European or Middle Eastern versus people who are Muslim or Christian. The nation state law passed by Israel in 2018 made it crystal clear that Israel is an apartheid state. The third demand or ask from the BDS movement is respecting, protecting, and promoting the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. Since its violent establishment in 1948, through the ethnic cleansing of more than half of the indigenous people of Palestine, Israel has set out to control as much land and uproot as many Palestinians as it can. As a result of this systematic forced displacement, there are now more than 7.25 million Palestinian refugees. They're denied the right to return to their homes simply because they are not Jewish. This third stipulation of the BDS campaign is, to my thinking, the most important. Besides UN Resolution 194, the right of return has a solid foundation in international law. I and many Palestinians hold onto the keys of our lost homes. We dream of returning to our communities, homes, and farms. Our right to return to our homes and communities in Palestine, in addition to being stipulated in the United Nations Resolution 194, is a right that has a solid foundation in international law in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 13, Section 2, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 12. Based upon my religious affiliation, as a Christian, Israel refuses to allow me my return. When I travel to Palestine, I can stay only if the Israeli government chooses to let me stay, usually a maximum of 3 weeks. When I traveled to Ramallah and the West Bank for serving for my Fulbright Senior Scholar Program at Sate University, I was given permission for only 3 months. My program had a duration of 6 months, so I had to go through the expense of leaving. I went to Amman, Jordan, and then re-entered the West Bank. I ran the risk of Israel not letting me return. When I revisit my homeland, I regularly go to Jaffa to look at my home, which is now houses 15 apartments for Israeli citizens. This is a story in itself, and we don't have time to go over that here today. So my take on the right of return is that it is the most important of the 3 asks of the BDS movement. Without the right of return, justice cannot be served. I would add here as well that if you had been watching the war in Ukraine and seeing the exodus of the refugees into neighboring countries, you will note that many of them expressed the wish to return to their homes and country once the bombs stop falling. No one questions their right to return or their wish to return, but somehow this is very basic right is denied to Palestinians. And thank you. I'll be glad to answer questions later on.
Thank you, Nahida. We're still waiting for Mazin to arrive. He had an emergency today in Alberta. So
do you want me to go on for the second part?
Yes, Nahida, if you would, that would be wonderful. So the second part, if I could introduce it, is effectiveness of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. If you're ready, Nahida, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to move now to the subject of the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And I want to add that I have signed on to this campaign and have acted upon my pledge to boycott. It may seem strange that we would want to boycott academic institutions because we tend to think of them as bastions of truth and freedom. However, the Israeli universities have been major, willing, and persistent accomplices in Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. Moreover, some of these universities are built on stolen private Palestinian land. They are involved in developing weapon systems and military doctrines deployed in Israel's war crimes, such as in Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza many times. Also, they are involved in justifying the ongoing colonization of Palestinian land, rationalizing gradual ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians, providing moral justification for extrajudicial killing, and systematic discrimination against non-Jewish students. Israel's relentless and deliberate attack on Palestinian education goes back all the way to the 1948 Nakba, when Israel plundered or destroyed tens of thousands of Palestinian books. During the first Intifada between 1987 and 1993, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities, some for several years, all 1,194 Palestinian schools, and eventually kindergartens. So Palestinians had to build what the Israelis described as illegal networks of underground schools. In my book, Palestine's Our Home, Gabi Baramki, the acting president of Sate University, during the First Intifada, explains in some detail his experiences trying to keep the university functioning. He was the acting president because Israel exiled Versailles president Hanna Nasser, who was not able to return after many years. For these reasons and many others, I signed on to the PACBI and pledged to boycott Israeli academic institutions. One of the guidelines for the call is refusing any form of academic and cultural cooperation with Israeli institutions. I had occasion to exercise that pledge when I was asked to be part of a research team of Israeli academics and some at Case Western Reserve University. I refused, and when called by the Israeli principal investigator, I explained my reasons. Her entreaties were of no avail. Unfortunately, Israeli institutions regularly seek research funds from US research granting organizations, and some are funded. Next, I would briefly like to describe some of the activities of religious denominations in the United States that have successfully divested from companies that are directly involved in Israel's program of domination of Palestinians and the denial of their human rights. Most denominations have general assemblies. Some meet every 2 years, others every 3 or 4 years. During these general assemblies, the churches consider resolutions put forth by church members. For years, I've been active in the Israeli-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church USA, and I'll shorten that from here on as PCUSA. I and several others within the group have been active in writing resolutions and successfully having them be adopted as church policy. The PCUSA was the first religious denomination to divest from 3 US companies which were complicit in the Israeli government campaign to deny Palestinians their human rights. The church owned Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Caterpillar stock. Motorola products were used to equip soldiers with communications devices. Hewlett-Packard equipment was used in monitoring Palestinians as they passed through checkpoints, and Caterpillar tractors were used to demolish homes, build a legal apartheid wall, uproot olive trees, and destroy much farming infrastructure. These Caterpillars were huge affairs, some of them as high as 2 stories. And in fact, some of them were frequently weaponized, some with mounted machine guns as well. A Caterpillar tractor was used in killing Rachel Corey, a US student from Olympia, Washington, who was trying to prevent the destruction of a home of a dentist living in Rafah, Gaza. When an organization owns stock in a company, it has the privilege to attend shareholder meetings to present resolutions. PCUSA worked along with other religious organizations for 10 years, during which time they attempted to reason with the administrations of these 3 corporations. Their numerous attempts did not produce results, and so the church divested from these 3 corporations. It was big news at the time. Clearly, the church did not own so much stock that divesting would produce any deleterious effects to these corporations. However, the principle is well understood. Other denominations in succeeding years followed suit. Another organization which I serve as co-chair is Friends of Sabeel North America. We have a program which enlists the cooperation of churches to become what we call Hewlett-Packard free churches. This simply means that they pledge not to buy or use any Hewlett-Packard equipment. To date, there are more than 100 such churches. And finally, I will review an overture which I wrote and which was passed and became church policy. The title of the overture was on opposition to congressional and state anti-BDS legislation. If you're interested in the full text and the rationale of this overture, you can find it on the internet and to PC-biz. You then search for 223rd General GA or General Assembly for 2018. Then you go to the Middle East Issues Committee and you look for Overture 12-02. I will read its aims. Since we have time, I was planning to not read all of them, but I think each of them is instructive and interesting. The first aim says to reaffirm PCUSA support for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights as expressed in the 2010 General Assembly in 1998. In other words, the church, the PCUSA affirmed this bill. But I want to note here that in the United States government, unlike most governments in the world, is not a signatory to the law. Even Israel has signed this law. The second aim is to defend and advocate for the constitutional protection under the First Amendment for all United States citizens, religious and civic organizations, companies and corporations that exercise their freedom of speech, association, and other civil rights to support measures for economic witness designed to bring those freedoms and rights to Palestinians and other persons living without full citizenship and under occupation. The third aim, oppose specific US legislation to suppress measures of economic witness. For example, the BDS policies and strategies such as the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, Senate Bill 720, and House Resolution 1697. These were identical, and they were on the floor of the for consideration at the Senate and the House when this overture was being considered. These bills sought to impose civil and criminal penalties for nonviolent BDS resistance against human rights violations in Israel and Palestine. The fourth aim, which I think is very interesting, in cases where litigation exists challenging state and anti-BDS statutes on the First Amendment grounds, instruct the stated clerk of the PCSA, stated clerk is sort of like our Pope, he's the main top honcho, to provide support by filling amicus curiae briefs in appropriate situations. This aim has never been tested, and you might find, your group might find it interesting to seek the help of the Presbyterian Church USA in this regard. And finally, directed stated clerk and the Middle East staff team to develop and implement strategies for interreligious dialogue, employing the help of appropriate pertinent USA agencies and standing committees concerning the importance of free speech and association for all Americans, including the right to protest through boycott, divestment under the First Amendment. This resolution passed during the 223rd General Assembly and became church policy in 2018. The Senate Bill 720, H.R. 67 were introduced and read into the 115th Congress, which was held between 217 and 218. It was sponsored by 58 senators, including Ohio Senator Portman. But however, the bill died. I don't know if the Presbyterians had any effect, but we were on the right track. The PCOC has been on the forefront of church organizations relating to Palestinian human rights. When the church was considering divestment, there was a large graffiti on the wall in Bethlehem that urged Presbyterians to divest. It was a huge graffiti, and I took pictures. As an indication of how far we at the PCOC have come, I will read to you an excerpt from the address we delivered, which was delivered by Reverend J. Herbert Nelson II, the stated clerk of the PCOC, on the occasion of the Martin Luther King Jr. Day, January 16, 2022. I'm going to take my time and read a little bit of it. He says, I pray that the inequalities in our society will not be overlooked. Many Presbyterians have labored before us on this journey toward justice. Our commitment to justice advocacy is still heralded in many quarters of our world. Our commitment to the civil rights movement and dismantling apartheid are examples of our commitment to justice advocacy. We encourage you to utilize the PCUSA Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. as a starting point. Let us not be too late in this period of opportunity to free the captives. Then he went on to say, and this is really wonderful, that he actually had the guts to say it. The continued occupation in Palestine and Israel is 21st century slavery and should be abolished immediately. Given the history of Jewish humble beginnings and persecution, there should be no ambiguity as to the ethical, moral, and dehumanizing marginalization and enslavement of other human beings. The United States of America must be a major influence of calling this injustice immoral and intolerable. Quite predictably, Reverend Nelson was viciously attacked for his comments and was labeled as an anti-Semite. And to his credit, he doubled down and did not retract the statement. In an article published in Mondawise by Kairos USA FASNA, which is Friends of Sabeel North America, and PCAP, the Palestinian Christian Association for Peace, voiced their support of Reverend Nelson and his brave statement. I will close by quoting from that article. The Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace joins Kairos USA and the Friends of Sabeel North America in supporting Reverend J. Herbert Nelson in his courageous stance. We are reminded to follow the call of the Jewish and Christian scriptures to be with God, who took the side of the poor and downtrodden against the powerful. Thank you. I'm glad to answer any questions that might arise.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lifelong commitment to the Palestinian cause, Palestinian struggle. I know you've been directly affected at a very young age. So we definitely appreciate all the work that you've done until return, as we say.
Thank you.
to Palestine.
Thank
We
you.
will have some questions and answers at the end. We're going to hear from two other speakers at the moment. When Mazin comes on, he can add his presentation as well. But now we're going to hear about the challenges to BDS on both sides, those that oppose and those that support BDS and free speech, not only in Ohio, but across the nation. Let's see, Eric, you're going to go next, or Terry? Okay, next, Eric Resnick.
Thank you, Don. Ooh, is that better? Hopefully we won't hear too much from the people who oppose BDS. I have just a couple of pictures here. Give me the screen, Don. Can you give me the screen?
Oh, sorry. Let's get this down.
Okay, I think that'll do it.
Eric, ask if they can hear you, okay?
Can you hear me?
On Zoom, okay, good, okay.
Wait, am I muted?
Everyone said they could hear you, so you're good.
Oh, okay. Well, then never mind. We don't do this every day. All right. There's my contact information. I'm very willing to provide whatever documents you want. Just contact me offline, and I'll be happy to share. So my role in this is to do a couple of things, and one is to tell you a little bit about what House Bill 476 in Ohio is and how it got passed. So it passed the House 12/8/2016 by a 74-19 bipartisan vote. It passed the Senate the same day by a 26-5 bipartisan vote. It was subsequently signed by Governor Kasich, and it became effective March 21st, kind of an anniversary here today, 2017. It does two things, really. The first is it prohibits state agencies from entering into contracts with companies or individuals unless those companies or individuals declare that they are not boycotting Israel, nor do they support any boycotts of Israel. And the second thing that it does, and this was one of those things that caught us by surprise, quite frankly, because we were not expecting it, and it happened. It was an amendment from the floor that raised the Ohio foreign debt cap for government investments from 1% to 2%. So what the bill did is it allowed the state to double its investment in Israel bonds overnight. Now, prior to that, Ohio was already the #1 ranked state in the country in its ownership of Israel bonds, and they subsequently doubled them. And the person that we can thank for that actually is Josh Mandel, who was the treasurer of Ohio at the time, and he was pushing that. Israel bonds, let me just say, Israel bonds are a terrible investment and should not be held by any government or public entity for a number of reasons, which would be the topic of another teach-in. But Ohio is #1 this doubled them, and it allowed counties like Cuyahoga County to maximize their investments in Israel bonds as well. And because Israel bonds are really an indefensible an indefensible investment for government entities to have, what this really is just a gift to the state of Israel, courtesy of the American taxpayers. Prior to House Bill 476, there's a bunch of trips that were made by Ohio House members to Israel. The first round of those trips was paid for by the Negev Foundation, which is located on Taylor Road, not too far from here. It's one of many, what I call Zionist money laundries. It's a 501c3 corporation, and its stated purpose is to promote agriculture. However, the members who went were not members of the
Sorry, folks, we lost our Wi-Fi for a second here at the college.
We have music to start.
Can you hear me now, Nahida? Okay. I think Eric is gone from the meeting, so you have to rejoin the meeting, Eric. Our speaker just lost, unless you want to just sit at my computer and finish up.
This won't take
Okay, people are coming back in.
long. All right.
So just so you know, we have a number of people in the room here today as well, here at Cleveland State. So we have another 15 participants here and 20 online.
I'm joined.
I'm gonna let you in as soon as it shows. Didn't show yet, Eric.
The little thing spinning around.
Okay, here comes Eric.
Okay, am I on now? Get the share back.
And someone asked if they can hear the name of the Taylor Road Zionist organization that Eric mentioned.
Negev Foundation.
Oh, yeah, the Negev Foundation.
Negev Foundation.
N-E-G-E-V.
Negev Foundation, as in the desert. Okay, so I'm going to try to share this again. Wait a minute. All right, what you're getting now is not what you should have. Let me go to over here. Y'all can read my email and tell how disorganized I am. All right. All right. So I think I was talking about Keith Faber. Keith Faber is now the state auditor. He went on the trip, and Lou Gentile was the Democratic whip. What?
You're not showing the right thing yet.
Oh, good Lord.
Give it a second, folks. He's getting that screen sharing fixed up.
I know. It's all right. Everybody's got good humor.
You got to open it first in your email.
Is that what I got to do? There it is. There. Is it open?
You got to open it in your email first and then share.
All right.
Unless you just want to speak and look at your own notes. You know,
Well, this is
however
important.
you like.
Wait a minute. Here we go. All right. This is what I got to do. Okay. Now, share. Desktop. Share. Oh, this is terrible. All right. Now, how's that?
No, it's not working. If you just want to speak
All
and
right.
look at your notes, you can.
All right. Well, I will look at
Put your
it.
camera on so we can see you, please.
My camera's not on? No, my camera's not on. Okay.
There we go.
Okay. So I can see the slides. All right. So Lou Gentile, who was then the Democratic whip and at that time was expected to run for governor of Ohio. I'm mute. No,
Oh, you're muted, Eric?
no. I'm not muted. Okay.
Yeah, but you're not on Zoom. See, you have a hashtag. to unmute.
That's just down. That's down.
Oh,
Okay. Can I be heard? Okay.
Yes.
So the Jewish community of Ohio was very much behind this. They used their communications organs like the Jewish newspapers and whatever, and put out these alerts about standing up, take a stand against BDS, support House Bill 476. I'm just reading this one. This was supposed to be a slide. That's not a slide. Several states across the country, as diverse as South Carolina and Illinois, including Arizona, Florida, and Indiana, have enacted legislation taking a stand against BDS. Other states are now considering similar legislation, and it points to Ohio with House Bill 476.
your slide is back
Huh?
on. You're on your slide.
The slide's down.
Oh, good.
It's on, but keep
Oh,
going.
good.
Yeah. You shouldn't have told us. There you
No,
go.
we got it, we got it.
All right.
Right.
Which slide is up there?
No, you're
It's up,
okay.
it's up.
Okay.
Stand
So-
against
so-
BDS.
So there it is.
Slide 5.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm not looking at slide 5. So at the time, one of the sponsors of the bill was Stephen Slesnick, who actually I've known since he was a little kid. I was his day camp counselor. My mom was his nursery school teacher. He and I share a birthday. We share email. Is that on there?
Yeah.
Oh, my
Kurt.
goodness. Yeah, that's it. That's the right one. So I sent Stephen an email, and this is the first time I've ever shared this publicly. And I was complaining about this and like, what are you doing? How can you do this? So he wrote me back. This is what he said. I believe this is Kirk's bill. Kirk Scheuring. Kirk Scheuring is now Senator Kirk Scheuring. He's my state senator, Kirk Scheuring. He went on the Negev trip and he was the lead sponsor. He said, I believe this is Kirk's bill. This is the key sentence. I will support the Jewish community in what it asks me to do. Do you have an issue with this? If so, please let me know. I hope all is well. We will speak soon. We didn't. So pretty much they did a lot of work prior to introducing these bills, and the freight was paid everywhere that freight needs to be paid. So let's talk a little bit about the testimony, because it was interesting. And there were a lot of people who testified as proponents of the bill. A lot of us testified as opponents of the bill. I want to focus on the proponents for just a second and give you the short version of who was there. It was a lot of the usual suspects. It was Jewish business owners who did business with Israel came and said, "Oh, thank you so much for protecting my business interests." It was the Federation and the Ohio Jewish Communities, which is their state lobbying arm, who were down there, and they were actually talking about anti-Semitism. Very quickly in the hearings, for those of us who were there, it morphed from BDS very quickly into anti-Semitism. And this is a bill that's going to fight anti-Semitism. I'll talk about that in a second. There was Eric Fingerhut, one-time state senator Eric Fingerhut. At that time, he was the executive director of Hillel, which, for those of you in the room nodding your heads, you know what a terrible organization Hillel is, and what an uber Zionist organization they are. And you know the role that Hillel plays in using this law to silence speech. And Eric Fingerhut's testimony is actually quite disgusting, because he served in the legislature with a number of the people in the room. So he basically came in and glad-handed, and, "Hey, remember when we did this? Remember when we did that? And wink, wink, by the way, you're going to pass this, aren't you?" The one that's really interesting, though, is this one, the one that I have should be on that screen, but it's not. Jennifer Gross, who is the senior, oh, it's back?
Yeah.
And I didn't touch anything. This is Don. Don is doing this. Don is doing this. I'm not touching anything. Don is doing this. So Jennifer Gross, who was the senior staff attorney of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. Now, let me pause there, because it is not, the Louis D. Brandeis Center is not affiliated with Brandeis University. Justice Brandeis would be appalled if they were using his name. It has nothing to do with human rights. It is more about lawfare than law. And they are the brainchild behind a lot of how these laws work. So she came and she testified. So she starts off, I just have excerpts of this in here, and I'm going to try to piece this together. It's on, oh my goodness, it's on the screen. So in here, she's introducing herself, and she talks about a case, Bronner versus Duggan. Now, Bronner versus Duggan, this is a footnote actually in here. Bronner versus Duggan is a case in which she was the attorney. She brought the case. It was 4 professors that brought the case against their professional organization, which had brought a resolution in favor of BDS, passed the resolution, and these 4 professors sued them. She represented the 4 professors. Subsequently, she lost the suit at the trial court. She lost it on appeal, and the circuit court refused to hear it en banc. But that was her claim to fame that she brought. So, okay, well, and I'm going to pause. We're going to let Mazin in.
Hi, Don.
He's in. Let him speak. Because
Sorry
he's the important one here.
for the dry run.
Hear from
didn't
me
join.
Welcome, Mazin.
I said, I'm sorry, I missed the dry run earlier,
Mute them. Mute
but
them.
I'm here now.
Mute.
yourself.
Okay, I will. All right, Mazin, I just want to let them know that if you want to go ahead and, give us a little overview of BDS, if you're up for it at the moment, and effectiveness of BDS, we would love to hear you.
Okay, how long do you want me to speak?
Well, give us a good 20 minutes maybe, eh?
Okay. Okay, well, hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. And I know the time difference. There's a lot, there's an echo. I don't know if
I'm
other
sorry.
people can mute.
You know what? That's probably.
Maybe Eric, yeah, thanks. And hi, Nahida. I haven't seen you in a while. So it's what's going on in Palestine these days. Of course, everybody is focused on what's happening in Ukraine, and things are connected, of course, and we now have Ukrainian Jewish immigrants that are being settled on stolen Palestinian land in the West Bank. So, so things come around, as they say. Now, let me just say something about BDS. I was involved in actions for boycott, academic actions for boycott, starting in the early 1990s, when we were active with the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. And then late 1990s, when we started worrying about the refugees, and we were lobbying about that, we realized we needed new tools. And one of these was boycott and divestment sanctions. And so, and then of course, 2005 came that very brilliant statement that was originally signed by 171 organizations, but later was signed by thousands of organizations and individuals, which is the Palestinian Civil Society Call to Action. And it is not a coincidence, was modeled after the South African Call to Action, which happened in the 1950s. Now, the South African call, which was based on what and why was it important? It was based on the idea that Western governments are all supporting apartheid. And they continued, by the way, to support apartheid despite, after apartheid ended, at least the apartheid, that's a political apartheid, there's still economic apartheid in South Africa. But most Western governments claimed that they have always supported freedom in South Africa. When the record, which is available to anybody to look up, shows that all Western governments supported apartheid. Now, I use the term Western governments to refer to primarily Western Europe, the US, Canada, Australia. Those are the primary countries that have become also kind of ironically, when they speak about Ukraine or other countries, they talk about the world community, as if these are the world community. The white people are the world community. Well, sorry, the world community is much larger than that. And this is actually a minority number of governments. They happen to hold a lot of the world economy in their hands, but most of the world economy that they got in their hands was due to of course, pillaging other countries and colonialism and so forth. This Western group of countries now, of course, added Israel since 1948. And Israel has become part of this so-called world community, a world community that's run for many, many decades by the primary superpower in this world, which is the US. Because of that, of course, the the people, whether the people who helped South Africa or who helped end the war in Vietnam or who helped with many other issues, civil rights, these are the people, the common people, who says, we don't believe governments. We think our governments are corrupt and that they support basically human rights violations. So we have to act. Hence, the idea of the BDS came in the 1950s in South Africa. And of course, it bore some fruits in the 1980s. It took over 30 years for it to mature, basically, and draw some fruits. I think the same happened with the Palestinian situation. Civil society call to action 2005, so we are now 17 years after. This civil society was made because of this quote unquote Western world and Western media, mainstream media, that is so dominated by the narrative of the oppressor that the narrative of the oppressed is basically lost. And most people don't even know there is a Palestinian struggle and that there are millions and millions of Palestinian refugees. I mean, and the best evidence of this, I think I don't need to tell you, is the fact that what is, and the Western media now is saying about Ukraine and so forth, after 26 days of occupation of parts of Ukraine by Russia, how much the Western media is focused on that to the point of almost obsession with vilifying Russia and anybody who tries to say anything about the US role in all of this. So when you think about that and how it has transpired, you see why the common people say, well, wait a minute, if we are saying all this much about Ukraine for 26 days and refugees coming out of Ukraine, imagine if this would continue for 7 or 8 decades and the refugees are never allowed to return to their homes and lands. There is something wrong here. There's a disconnect, there's a hypocrisy, if you want. And people start to see this. And I think we need to actually amplify this hypocrisy and keep doing it. I mean, there's a friend of mine in Connecticut, his name is John Levnevsky, and he uses an email of land of hypocrisy about living in the US. This is a land of hypocrisy. It's a land of duality of messages, and that dictatorships are welcome as long as they are, friendly to the US. I mean, take also the use of the word oligarch, Russian oligarchs. Well, what about American oligarchs? Why can't we talk about that for a while? Or Israeli oligarchs who are billionaires profiting from stealing Palestinian lands and resources for decades now. So again, the BDS, the beauty of the BDS, in my humble opinion, if I was to sum it up, the beauty of the BDS is like saying the emperor has no clothes, It's daring to point out something here that is not right. And this is why it's attacked, basically. And, the emperor, of course, doesn't like to be told he's naked, So they have to attack the BDS movement, and the attack is very vicious, by the way. I'll give you the latest story that I'm involved in. I don't know if you heard or not, but the Sierra Club was organizing a trip to Israel, so-called Israel, and we discovered this back in early January, and we wrote to the Sierra Club, and several of us, including Sierra Club members. I am not a Sierra Club member, but I wrote to them as a Palestinian environmentalist since the Sierra Club claims to be environmental group, whatever. And they answered me with the typical form letter, you know. I, of course, pointed out that this is promotion, this is greenwashing occupation, all of this, and that this trip shouldn't happen. But if they insist on having it, at least they should show both sides of the story, so to speak, side of human rights and the side of the oppressor. Well, of course, they responded with the usual diplomatic nonsense. And, you know, that we value your opinion, Sierra Club is not a political organization, blah, blah, blah. You know, and this was in late January. And then we started pressuring them more and more. And then they changed their mind. They didn't want to make the trip. And the Zionists somehow, I guess somebody in the Sierra Club board or somebody who's a Zionist, you know, alerted them, the Western Jewish Zionist media, that this is happening. Sierra Club was pressured into canceling a trip. So they started to mobilize in large numbers to pressure the Sierra Club to reverse its decision. And it's remarkable, within 24 hours, 48 hours, it was reversed. The decision was to continue the trips. Sierra Club issued a statement saying that they will travel to Israel and that they are not a political organization, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now fast forward another month and a half or so, and Sierra Club issues a statement in support of Ukraine against Russia, you know? So clearly the Sierra Club is not an apolitical environmental organization. The Sierra Club takes the positions like most Western, quote unquote, liberal neocons, if you want, which is a position that's dependent on who the protagonists are. And so it is hypocritical, you know, for them to say, well, we're not political in this situation, but we are political in the other situation. So we, of course, are, you know, ramping up the campaign against them, and hopefully they will see the light. But if they don't, there are many, many people who are members of the Sierra Club who will quit the organization, and they will lose, and they will be on the side of the oppressor. And I'm sure in a decade or two, like most Western organizations, once they realized that apartheid ended in South Africa, they started saying, well, we've always supported freedom in South Africa. That is typical hypocrisy that comes in these issues. This is basically what I am working on now with a number of other groups and people. Adal in New York, Jewish Voice for Peace is doing a remarkably good job. Other people are working on these issues. I think what we have to do is be brave and honest and push hard on all fronts to expose this hypocrisy of the West and to say enough of this game. I mean, you look at Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, even if one doesn't want to focus just on Israel, of course, there are many oppressions around the world. The genocide that's going on in Yemen deserves everybody to boycott Saudi Arabia and to insist that all companies boycott Saudi Arabia, because it's a kleptocracy and it's a genocidal kleptocracy, which is similar to Israel, which is an apartheid kleptocracy. But anyways, Saudi Arabia needs to be targeted, and needs to be targeted strong. And we need to explain to the West why, when they say, well, we support democracy in Ukraine, let's say you support democracy in Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates or Israel, for that matter, which is not a democracy, it's an apartheid system. So this is what I think we have to keep pointing out. And of course, when you do that, you expect some backlash. And actually, when I don't have any backlash, I know I'm not doing enough. So I love to hear the backlash always. That means I'm doing something right. Whether I'm called an anti-Semite or called, or in the case of Jews, called self-hating Jews by somebody or whatever. I mean, that's normal, you know, situation. I'll stop here because we can also talk about things depending on what you're interested in, and I can tell you what's happening. The Naqab here is a big issue now, and there's it's on the verge of an uprising that will be cause a lot of deaths and injuries. People are desperate in the Negev as they are being cleared out of their homes and their homes demolished, etc. So a lot of people here are paying attention to what's going on in the Naqab. Happy to take questions or comments or criticisms or whatever.
So can you hear me, all?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, Mazin. I put Terry Lodge over in my seat because he's going to be coming up. But we could do a few questions and answers if you can stick on for a little bit. Mazin and Nahida, could you stick around for another 20 minutes?
Yes.
Awesome. So we could let Eric finish up, and then we'll go to Terry Lodge. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Now, is that better? Wait, let me get my screen share back. I also wanted to tell you, I neglected to tell you that one of the votes against House Bill 476 in the House was Teresa Fetter, who is running to be the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Ohio. So you might keep that in mind. All right, so back to Jennifer Gross, and I picked this particular piece of testimony because she's the one who really pulled the dangerous legal structure into of what they call anti-Semitism into the discussion. So this is her. This is, I think you can see that. Yeah. So this is just she's introducing herself. The person who founded the Brandeis Center that isn't affiliated with Brandeis and isn't a human rights thing. His name is Kenneth Marcus. Google that name. You'll find Marcus, Kenneth Marcus, right up here. You will find that his last gig was he was counsel for the Department of Education under Betsy DeVos in the Trump administration. So, I mean, these are just generally bad actors. So, okay, so she says, why is BDS anti-Semitic? And I think it's important. I don't know who's here and what your experience is, but I think it's important to recognize as we talk about this, how anti-Semitism and BDS gets conflated. So she says, aside from its anti-Semitic roots, BDS has been characterized as anti-Semitic within the definitions used in different places. There are 4 grounds on which anti-Israel hostility may properly be considered anti-Semitic. This is her talking. Right. Which are known as intentionality, tacitness, memetics, and Jewish trait principles. I kid you not. This is wacky stuff. This takes in everything and right. Well, but no, I mean, this is their legal framework. I think it's important to understand the legal framework or what they believe is their framework. So in other words, BDS movement is anti-Semitic to the extent, and please don't laugh when I say this, to the extent that its proponents are consciously motivated by anti-Jewish bigotry driven by unconscious anti-Semitism, immersed in a climate of opinion that is increasingly hostile to Jewish people or engaged in irrational ethnic trait discrimination. The one that's the most fun, the principle that's the most fun is the Memenics principle. Provides that some hostility to Israel is anti-Semitic in the sense that arises from a climate of opinion that is hostile to Jews, regardless of the conscious or unconscious beliefs of the speakers. I said, I kid you not. Whether BDS advocates are aware of it, either consciously or unconsciously, they often spread anti-Jewish stereotypes, images, and myths. So this is so my point in sharing that is to point out to you how they did this and how they feel about this today, because it's very important to the discussion to make that connection between why they hate BDS and why they say it's anti-Semitic. Now, several times, Dr. Gordon has given you the date of 2005. This all started to happen in 2005 when a group of Zionists got together and started talking about new Zion or new anti-Semitism. And they consciously, and the Brandeis Center is the group at the center of this, they consciously got together in 2005 when they realized that BDS could be successful, and they put together this framework in which it could be declared anti-Semitic, because nobody wants to be anti-Semitic. This is a conscious effort, and we're going to talk about more of this in the questions, I'm sure. I wanted to go to the hypocrisy in my testimony when it came time for the opponents, and many in this room were actually at that, including Terry and Don and Mark. Weren't you there, Jeff? Let me just tell you, it was kind of a circus. There was a guy walking around with a keffiyeh and a hat. He was made up to look like a terrorist, walking around the room, kind of bothering people. And we knew that it was kind of a false flag attack when the people who were in charge of the meeting didn't seem to mind that he was doing that. That's usually, nobody called security. That's the first clue that it's a false flag attack. But essentially, the opponents were Palestinians telling their personal stories. Of course, the ACLU and people like Terry telling them why legally they were not on solid ground. As a Jewish person, I made a point to talk about the hypocrisy, and I hit him with, this was a piece of my testimony, the resolution adopted by the Conference of American Rabbis in 1987 in support of BDS in South Africa, because their claim is that boycotts and divestments and sanctions are somehow bad tactics. It's bad for people. And a rabbi once told me that BDS is actually a bad thing for Palestinians, because in those companies that were boycotting, that's Palestinian that are, in the occupied territories and on stolen land, but they employ Palestinians. So if we put those companies out of business, the Palestinians will be out jobs. And I'm old enough to remember when the white Afrikaners in South Africa used that argument to try to defeat BDS there. And I mentioned that in my testimony too. But I actually included this resolution adopted by the CCAR to try to talk about their hypocrisy. And I want to talk about the future here. This is out today. This popped up this morning in 972 magazine, of how corporate interests are using the lawfare of this anti-BDS thing to try to make it less possible to challenge groups who are boycotting and urging the divestment in fossil fuels. They're trying to use that structure and legitimize it to a place where it can then be applied to other things in the United States. So I throw that in there because it's very dangerous. So I can talk about this all day. Please give me lots of questions and I can roll with it. So Terry.
Thank you, Eric.
Wow. And Terry's much better at this than me.
No, no.
Oh, no.
Not on the
They
screen.
should- Yeah, they should be able to see you now or hear you.
Go ahead, talk.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, folks?
Maybe he should, I'll pin him.
All right,
Okay.
let's give it a try.
Yeah, they said they could.
Okay,
Okay.
very good. I have to say, after listening to Mazin, I'm reminded of Mark Twain's quote about 115 years ago, that war is the way that Americans learn geography. Truly, and certainly the BDS movement hopefully is going to teach us a little bit more about global geography. And anyway, I want to talk just very quickly about several things. Number one, I'm speaking on behalf of a couple of other lawyers who for several years have made a standing offer that if we can identify a suitable plaintiff, we intend to try to take down House Bill 476. The problem with laws like House Bill 476 is that they're absolutely outrageous. It's an outrageous, ridiculous thing to pass a law that says you can't talk about something. This is, this is America, what's left of it. And this is a bedrock principle we're talking about. And it isn't the only attempt to repress people's right to speak. Obviously, the right to speak is critical because people with perhaps the worst grievances must be heard at some point there. If we are to have anything that looks like a just society or a just way of proceeding, we have to be able to hear from everybody. And this is a society with different size megaphones, clearly. So the mere right to be able to discuss ideas and to oppose others' ideas in a relatively civil way is incredibly important and growing the more so. I think that some of the anti-BDS legislative activity is actually targeting campuses, and in particular targeting activism that might result in requests for boards of trustees of state universities such as Cleveland State to divest of investments in Israeli bonds and other mechanisms. And that's the problem, is that you pass a law that says it's illegal for someone to basically hold a state office or receive a state benefit if they say anything by way of supporting a boycott of the state of Israel. And boards of trustees get to say, sorry, kids, we can't hear your complaint. We've all signed a loyalty oath, essentially, to another country as part of our responsibilities as trustees of a state university. So I think that that is actually where things tend to be aimed. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There are about 31 or 32 states that have passed some form of what the Ohio law states. And as Eric helpfully outlined for you, it's really a very straight ahead thing. You can't have a state contract. You can't receive a benefit from the state of Ohio unless you sign a loyalty oath. And that can range from being a carryout operator who sells lottery tickets for the Ohio Lottery Commission to a public defender who receives a commingled state payment for defending criminal defendants. It can, of course, be people who provide asphalt for streets and highways. It is pretty broad. There have been, at least from my research, at least 5 different federal courts in 4 different states have struck down very analogous to House Bill 476 provisions. In Kansas, there was a woman who was a Mennonite math tutor who wanted to sign a contract to tutor students in her local school district, and it contained a provision saying thou shalt not speak ill of Israel. She refused and sued and successfully prevailed. In Texas, there really is a school district named Pflugerville. There was a case of Amawi versus the Pflugerville Independent School District in 2019. Very similar outcome. A woman who was contracted or was going to be contracted to provide speech therapy diagnosis and follow-up with students refused to sign. She sues. It takes, and it's not like it's a slam dunk in the sense that you have to find lawyers willing to put in the time and make the detailed arguments. But she sues and ultimately wins. Abby Martin, who's an up-and-coming investigative journalist, won a nice one last year and has made a very elegant online statement, should you want to find it. She was invited to speak on something completely unrelated to Palestine. At the University of Georgia, they send her the contract saying, please sign this. She reads the fine print and finds the sentence that Georgia law requires that you, that you will not say anything against Israel. And in her, as I say, elegant online statement, she really details things. There were also, just in the last month or so, an engineering contractor in Houston successfully again knocked out the, I think his case was pending contemporaneously with the speech therapist in a different district court in Texas. But in any event, he wins because a city of Houston contract basically said, we have to follow state law, and state law says you cannot support a boycott of Israel. My favorite case, however, is the Arkansas Times versus Waldrop, which was a decision that on appeal came out last year. It was a weekly newspaper in a small town outside of Little Rock somewhere that was running advertisements from a branch campus of the University of Arkansas. And for years, for 20 or 30 years, had been running regular advertisements. It was obviously a source of some decent revenue flow. And all of a sudden, in 2019, they're presented with a contract requirement. And the editor of the Arkansas Times, which is from what I've read, is a small town weekly that publishes pictures of the homecomings and graduations and new plant coming to town kinds of events, school board meetings, very vital local information. I say that because my brother is on this Zoom right now, and he's a retired newspaper editor. But it is very vital information. But what I loved was the publisher of the Arkansas Times, basically after filing suit, commented that I didn't know a damn thing about Palestine and Israel before this, but you could bet we're going to be editorializing a lot about it from now on. And apparently he's lived up to that. The troubling part of that case, however, was that the trial judge initially, sort of informally, I think, must have told the attorneys that he was going to strike down the statute. The two sides file motions, and he ultimately rules in favor of the state. And on a ground that I'm afraid we're going to see advanced, the ground was that a real economic boycott is not an act of speech. And there is a 40-year-old, actually there's a kind of supporting stream of cases, but the principal one in American law, a Supreme Court decision from 1980 or 81, upheld a boycott of businesses that were arguably discriminating against Black residents of a small town in Alabama, Claiborne Hardware case. What I am concerned about is that ultimately one of these court challenges is going to possibly even succeed at the Court of Appeals level and proceed to our desultory US Supreme Court. And I'm very worried as to what that might do by way of gutting longstanding free speech principles. But I want to tell you that it's the court decisions that say that you cannot condition a benefit from the state on speech goes back 10 or 15 years before the Claiborne hardware case. These principles are really well established so that you don't have to bribe governmental officials to do their responsibilities. You don't have to somehow pass an extra deserving case with a social welfare worker who is considering whether or not you should be put on welfare or should receive food coupon benefits. There are lots of reasons above and beyond that where free speech cannot be conditioned. It can't be limited by other things when the government is trying to suppress it. One of the things that you also need to understand is that this is only one of these widespread, perhaps American Legislative Exchange Council driven so-called reforms. About 3 or 3.5 years ago in the US Senate, a bill was introduced to criminalize what was called anti-Semitic speech with a maximum 20-year federal prison sentence and a $250,000 fine. As I recall, it was sponsored by about 17 or 19 senators who boldly and, with apparently shamelessly dropped this into the hopper. It was ultimately shouted down by the likes of the ACLU and other civil libertarians, but it was a very express, upfront, in our collective faces attempt to say some speech is criminal in America. And that is a disturbing, ongoing trend that must not be ignored. So while I'm looking in my dotage, in my legal career, to at least have a piece of striking down House Bill 476, these are the kinds of things that you always have to be vigilant about. A friend of mine who has done a lot of capital defense work was commenting once on my environmentalism and civil liberties involvements, and he says, when they win, it's forever. If you win, it's a stay of execution. And I think that we have to generationally educate people that on campuses especially, we have to indulge in dialogue, and we have to allow people that we consider to be Zionist to be allowed to speak up. But more often than not, we're seeing the forces of Zionism and larger corporatism dominate what is permissible to be discussed on campus. Thanks.
It was good.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you all. We have a little bit of time for some questions. We could hear from the audience here and on chat. Let me see if anybody's in chat with a question so far. I see David with your hand up. Please go ahead, David.
So are you going to be able to hear me on this? Or do you repeat the question?
Yeah, repeat them.
Repeat.
Yeah, we'll repeat it. Go ahead.
Okay. It goes back to Eugene Debs. He was imprisoned because of speech. At that time, he was arrested. What I'm wondering actually is, with the successful federal cases, are those laws in those states still valid? So each time there's a different thing that happens, someone has to bring up a case, or are those laws totally invalid in those states?
The question is whether anti-BDS laws in other states that have been struck by federal courts exactly what is struck when a court makes a ruling like that. My hunch is that as with the Ohio House Bill 476, Eric pointed out that there was an amendment also to the allowable amount of investable capital that governments could make. I'm sure that what is stricken is any provision that says that you condition a contract arrangement with the state on content of speech. So those are probably gone. There is however, what I've learned in Ohio is that not many governmental units are particularly aware of this provision. They may be sent forms by the Department of Administrative Services. Here's a form to use when you're contracting for this or that kind of thing. And so these things slowly get rolled out and build a role in, I guess, institutional awareness. And I'm afraid just as slowly, these kinds of things will disappear, that people will talk for some time after a House Bill 476 type of provision is struck, still thinking it's the law and still repressing speech and still causing some kind of problem or controversy out of ignorance. So, and the problem, of course, also is just the mere fact, just to piggyback on what Eric said, the fact that we went, I mean, there were dozens of us saying, this is illegal. You can't pass this. You're wasting our time. We're taxpayers. You're wasting our money. Don't do this. And, you know, they very blithely and very quickly ramrodded this through in a lame duck session of the legislature. So the problem is the fact that it's even entertained, I think, is what needs to be talked about.
Briefly, an example of corporatism is in terms of protesting at companies that produce oil and that kind of thing.
Right.
Recently there was
Oh yeah, the infrastructure bills.
infrastructure. Yeah, that was passed and signed by the government.
Correct. And yes, the enhancements of penalties for things that are still chaining yourself to something in a nonviolent way to make a statement is still a little bit difficult to grab as a felony. But yeah, that there are many reactions to the exercise of speech going on, and in the guise of legislation and supposedly political leadership. And I'll shut up. I'm talking way too long here.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, we're fine, yeah.
Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, so the purpose of having this event was to try to trigger the law so that we may try and attempt to test it. Am I correct? And we were not successful in triggering the law. As you see, we're here meeting and having this event without the state saying, we're not going to give you that room anymore because you're boycotting Israel. So this was the initial strategy. It didn't work. How do we escalate? Where do we go from here? What's the next step?
So Jeff was asking,
We need to test this law.
Jeff was asking, the program today was supposed to be strategic, not only educational, but strategic in triggering a cancellation of this presentation because it violates, you know, the state law. So if someone would like to answer that question. And Jeff said, how do we escalate that?
Right.
To
What's the
make
next
this
step?
trigger happen.
We failed this time, but we can't walk away
Right.
from this strategy. Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, you know, fellow,
Well, no,
I
we're
know
still
what
here,
you're
but,
saying, yeah.
but we're not triggering a fight against the law.
Let someone up on the panel answer, please.
let me tell you, fellow lawbreakers. Yeah, I mean, we did have that as an idea, and we figured that we would either have we would either be a plaintiff or we'd have a great program, and I think we accomplished we accomplished half of what we set out to do. There will be a plaintiff that will happen, and as Terry said, all of this is really aimed at students. It affects everything, but it's really aimed at students at universities. And, I think you notice that at least in the audience, there's some absence of students here. You can attribute that to the fact that they're just a day in from spring break, or maybe they're a little nervous. We don't know. But at some point, and we've had, we had a couple groups, and we had an Ohio State group right out of the box that could have been, grade A plaintiff of this, but they just didn't want to do it. They just didn't have the fortitude to stand up for themselves, and you can't have plaintiffs that won't do that. There will be plaintiffs, and in states where this has been challenged, it's gone down. Yes, there's bad stuff out there, but the basics of the law has gone down. And what the judge wrote in the Kansas case was, and it's quoted in all of the other ones subsequently, was just, this is the most, I'm paraphrasing. She said, this is basically the most un-American thing I've ever seen. And it's such a rout in the courts that the states aren't even appealing them. I mean, it's just because there's nothing there. So we'll talk in our group as to if there's a way to escalate this, but yes, full disclosure, that was one of the things that we hoped to trigger today. We did not trigger it.
I see there's a couple questions here. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so thank you for letting me know we're muted. If we could have any closing comments from Dr. Gordon and Dr. Qumsiyeh, and who would like to go first?
I'll just say a few things. Thank you for the program.
Oh, here we go. Let's turn you up. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Thank you.
Thank you for having us here. There's one thing I feel a little bit, a certain amount of umbrage about when I hear the word anti-Semitic. Somehow, somewhere along the line, the Zionist community decided to take on the term Semite and define it their own way. And in my opinion, a Semitic person is any person who speaks a Semitic language. That includes Arabs, Jews as well, and a host of other people in the area. So to be anti-Semitic, you could be anti-Palestinian. So in some ways, I see Zionists as being anti-Semitic. They have taken off on this term, and they're using it as a weapon. And it seems to have been an incredibly effective weapon in the United States. So that's all I wanted to say. I just get uptight about this thing. And again, thank you. And I hope you succeed in trying to find a person to sue the state. And I hope you win. If there's anything I can do, or the Presbyterian Church, their Office of Public Witness can do to help, please use their resources. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Mazin, are you still on with us? If you'd like to make some closing comments, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for doing this. And again, apology for not being there from the beginning. Just had an emergency I had to take care of. the situation in the world is worrisome, of course. We're on the verge of a world war if we don't pay attention and get engaged. I always think that it is not, you know, in our circles, they used to say, well, we're the 99%, they are the 1%. I actually think they're more like the 0.1% or 0.05%. But anyways, we're the vast majority. The problem is the vast majority is silent. And change in society happens not from a majority of people. Civil rights did not happen because a majority of Americans rose against the oppression. It was actually the threshold effect. Usually it's like going from 1% active community to 2% active community. That marginal change in activists is what makes a difference in society. We know that from studying history and retrospectively, looking at numbers of people, for example, demonstration against the Vietnam War and things like that. Of course, you know, a lot of people were against the Vietnam War, but they never did anything about it. It's just that there was a minority that became a larger and more vocal minority. And I think that's how societies change. You know, and we can say that with regards to the Palestine-Israel question, you know, that's also how it will happen. But I'm also more worried now about bigger issues and the issues of global effects, and that we need a global revolution, a global intifada, I would say, that would make a big difference because it's actually existential for humanity. If we don't do this, if we don't get our act together and change the way we do business and, you know, and stop, you know, this consumerist trend that we are going, you know, the climate change, I'm involved in environmental issues. Climate change is going to basically make it irrelevant whether people are anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic. It will make everybody, I mean, like Einstein said, you know, I don't know what the Third World War will be fought with what weapons, but I know that the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones. So, so we're really in trouble, and I think we have to take it very seriously and think and connect people more to these things. Palestine provides kind of the Achilles heel of Western hypocrisy, just like South Africa was the Achilles heel of Western hypocrisy in terms of the way they do things. So I hope we can use Palestine as a tool for education, but we should not limit ourselves to talk just about Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks to all of our speakers today. And I want to give a special thanks to Jeff Kassouf for helping me set this up. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had it. Sorry if we didn't get to all the questions in the chat and whatnot, but maybe we can email them off to folks for later. Thank you all. We'll do this again.
Thanks. I'll put my email in the chat also in case somebody wants to get in touch with me.
Uh-oh. Go ahead, Mazin. Were you saying something?
No, I was saying I can put my email in the chat in case people want to connect with me. And
there it is.
Continue the conversation.
Do you have any more time for questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question from us.
If you want, Mazin, could you stick around? We got one more question here.
Okay.
But Helen had one first. Should we let her go first? Helen, you had one first. Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I'm really not more important. They're more. I just wanted to ask Mazin, a lot of people are saying that
The voice is not very clear. Can you come closer to the microphone?
Wait a minute, he's trying to say something. I'm sorry. Say it again, Mazin.
I cannot hear what he is
Oh, he
saying.
couldn't hear you.
Come to the microphone or something.
Yeah, come on, Jeff.
A lot of people, Mazin, hi Mazin, Jeff Kasuf here. Hey, a lot of people are saying that Ukraine, our vehemence against Ukraine at the highest levels of the elite and the political classes and the military classes is about what happened in Syria, about what happened with Iran, about our alliances that are stopping the plan for complete takeover in the Middle East, that Russia had acted in a way that sort of built a wall or stopped the US's and Zionism's plan for the Middle East. So I wondered if you might speak to that thought.
Yes, thank you. Ukraine is part of a geopolitical chess game that's going on that's much deeper and more complicated than most of the people realize. And certainly the Western media is not helping by making it look like there is a bad guy, Putin, who just decided to invade Ukraine, and there's so much, obviously, the issue of gas and oil in the world, which is harmful to the environment. Nevertheless, is Germany and other European countries were growing more and more dependent on Russian oil and gas. And so the West was not happy about that. And there was an expansion of NATO. Let me give you one small example, which you may not have even heard about. A few weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Israel hit a base in Iran that makes drones, basically, destroying like 100 drones. A few weeks later, Iran hit a Mossad base in Erbil in Kurdistan. Apparently, Israel has established intelligence bases in Kurdistan, which were used also to target that, because the Israeli drone that was fired on Iran came from Kurdistan, from that area. And apparently the Iranians found out which building it came from and they hit it. And this was unprecedented, because usually Iran threatens to retaliate against Israeli attacks in Syria and other places. But this is the first time that the Iranians actually take credit for it. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard said, yes, we hit this. This was a Mossad base. The Kurdish government and the others, the US, etc., the Western media, tried to bury the story and also tried to ignore the ramifications of it. There are ramifications of it. Part of this has to do with the fact that there were ideas, and that's part of the reason why Syria and Afghanistan and so forth are important places, because of gas and oil connections. There was the notion of making an Iraqi-friendly government that will help transport, gas and oil from the Gulf region to Europe, bypassing the needs for Russian oil and gas. And so there is this and Israel, of course, is in the picture, because Israel is in the picture throughout the Middle East, but Israel is also interested in taking its own gas, which is Palestinian gas that they steal, and pumping it to Europe via Turkey. And that's why there's a rapprochement between Turkey and Israel. But Israel is also not interested in pissing off the Russians too much, because they need Russian cooperation so that the Russians don't shoot Israeli planes that are, attacking Iranian positions in Syria. If I could go on and on, but you can see the complexity of the situation and its relationship to Ukraine, because Ukraine, of course, is that key bloc that was left in Eastern Europe for NATO to acquire, to basically encircle Russia completely and make sure and cut off Europe from Russian gas. This was the next step that they were going to take. Russia decided, if it's going to go down that road, I should take the first step and, have them for breakfast before they have me for lunch, so to speak. So that's the geopolitics. I'm not supporting Russia. I'm just saying, Putin is just as imperialist as Biden and all these people. But this geopolitical game, of course, that people pay the price for, whether Palestinians or Ukrainians or Russians, etc. This geopolitical game is very, very dangerous. And the small blocks they are playing with can transform into bigger blocks, as happened in First World War, Second World War, and before that, of course, the Crimean War, if we recall, in the 19th century. So they could tumble down, so to speak, and the snowball could grow bigger. But Russia and China are places to pay attention to, and especially China, because China has an economy that's much stronger than Russia. And China has now decided that they're not going to let, there's an Arabic story about the three bulls, one white, red, and black. And, and the lion came and talked to the white bull and said, these guys, they are your enemies, my enemies. Let me kill the black bull, and so then it went to the second bull, and then the white bull was left, and the white bull finally said, when the lion came to eat him, well, it's I was eaten the day the black bull was eaten. So China decided that they're not going to let this go, because soon the same thing will happen to China, economic sanctions, etc., to destroy it, because the US wants to be the sole hegemonic power in the world. And that's why they're going after China now. But China is playing in those places also, in Ukraine and in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. China is playing a much smarter game, I think, than either Russia or the NATO/US/Israel bloc.
Thank you, Mazin. Thank you all. We have a recording of this, so we'll be sending this to everybody. And I think this is a wealth of information that we could use, and we must keep the struggle.